Elijah Brooks stood frozen in the staff lounge, white faces watching as the math professor called him diversity with a syllabus. The room laughed, quiet, complicit, but when Elijah grabbed a marker and walked to the board, they didn't know he'd once outscored MIT's best. Now, they were about to find out. What he wrote next changed the entire school. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel, and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. It was a Wednesday afternoon, when Elijah Brooks, dressed in his signature charcoal blazer and rust-red tie, walked into the faculty lounge of Madison West High. He had no reason to expect anything unusual. A warm thermos of mint tea in hand, his plan was simple: 15 minutes of quiet before his 3:15 elective class, reclaiming Black voices in American literature. The lounge, like most things at Madison West, had an unspoken hierarchy. The math and science departments dominated the long oak table in the center, cluttered with laptops, graphing calculators, and reusable mugs adorned with formulas. The English and social studies folks, Elijah among them, usually kept to the smaller side table near the window. But today, something felt off the moment Elijah stepped in. The air was colder. Conversations dipped into silence. Eyes followed him, not just glanced, followed. Professor Charles Whitmore, head of mathematics and a tall, silver-templed man, with a smile that never reached his eyes, stood near the whiteboard, arms folded. "Afternoon, Brooks," Whitmore said, his voice smooth as lacquer but sharp underneath. "We were just discussing academic rigor. You may have some thoughts." Elijah raised an eyebrow. "Depends on what kind of rigor you're talking about." Chuckles bubbled from the math crowd, but they didn't sound amused, more like entertained, the way an audience watches the opening act of a show they didn't pay for. Whitmore gestured to the board. It was already half filled with a sprawling calculus equation, the kind Elijah hadn't seen in nearly 20 years. Chain rule nested within an integral, limits approaching infinity, and a complex fraction that looped across two lines. "We were wondering," Whitmore continued, "how one might approach this problem from, say, a literary point of view." More laughter. This time some from behind Elijah. He didn't need to turn around to know who it was. Danielle from physics, Todd from chemistry, both of whom hadn't spoken to him outside of staff meetings in months. Elijah took a sip of his tea and set it down. He looked at the board, then at Whitmore. "I'm assuming this isn't about calculus." "Oh, it is," Whitmore said, walking to the board and grabbing a marker. "You see, there's been some concern lately about academic equity. The idea that all departments are of equal intellectual weight." Elijah kept his posture relaxed. Interesting concern, especially coming from the department that just applied for $50,000 in STEM funding, without consulting the rest of the faculty. The room tensed. A few heads turned. Whitmore didn't flinch. "Be that as it may, we're simply curious. Literature is interpretive. Math is exact. And you're suggesting one is superior." "Not at all," Whitmore replied, though the smugness in his tone betrayed the lie. "Only that some fields demand a higher level of analytical thinking. Wouldn't you agree?" Elijah smiled, though it didn't reach his eyes either. "I suppose that depends on your definition of analysis." Another beat of silence. Whitmore stepped back from the board and gestured broadly to the equation. "So, care to take a stab?" The implication was clear. Elijah, a Black literature teacher, had no business in this conversation. No seat at this table. No right to challenge the hierarchies so deeply embedded in the school's culture. He walked up to the board, slowly, under a dozen gazes laced with expectation, most of it hoping for failure. The scent of dry erase marker and peppermint oil, someone always used it for stress, filled his nostrils. He studied the equation for a full 30 seconds, letting the tension thicken. He turned to Whitmore. "You wrote this just now?" "From memory," Whitmore said proudly. "Impressive," Elijah said softly. Then he picked up the blue marker, not the black one Whitmore had used, intentionally choosing a different color, a quiet assertion of difference. Elijah wrote one small note in the margin. "Assumes continuous differentiability, problematic if fx undefined at x0.
A murmur rippled.
Whitmore blinked. Elijah stepped back. "Interesting problem, but your limits contradict the domain of your function. So before we can solve it, we'd need to reframe it. Otherwise your solution is technically invalid." A hush fell over the lounge. Even the ever-typing math club TA in the corner stopped clicking. Whitmore stared at the board, and for a moment Elijah saw it. the flash of discomfort behind his eyes, the kind that comes when a house of assumptions begins to tilt. But before he could respond, Principal Hendricks walked in. She stopped mid-step, taking in the room's silence, the tension so thick it buzzed. "Everything all right here?" "Just a discussion on interdisciplinary respect," Whitmore said quickly. "Well, keep it civil." "Students can hear from the hallway," Hendricks said, then left just as fast. Whitmore smiled again, forced. "How about this?" he said, erasing the board aggressively. "Let's make it interesting. Next Friday, auditorium, you and me, a friendly intellectual exhibition." Elijah narrowed his eyes. "What kind of exhibition?" "I'll present a set of calculus problems. You solve them, publicly. If you win, I'll personally endorse a proposal for equal departmental funding. If I win, you concede that your field has less quantitative rigor." Gasps. Elijah paused, long enough that the room started whispering. He could feel it, how they wanted him to decline, how badly they wanted him to admit he couldn't do it. He looked at Whitmore and said calmly, "All right, but I get to bring my own challenge too. Something from literature. You solve mine, I solve yours." Whitmore's mouth tightened. "Deal." And then he picked up the marker again, drew a fresh equation more complex than the last, and turned to Elijah. "Solve it," he said, the corners of his mouth curling. "If you can." Elijah stands in front of the board, facing an even more complex equation, as the entire staff lounge watches, waiting to see if he'll fold. The hallway lights buzzed faintly, as Elijah Brooks walked away from the staff lounge, the burn of 100 eyes still prickling on the back of his neck. His grip on the thermos was tight. It wasn't the calculus equation that stung, it was the way they laughed, not at a joke, but at the idea that someone like him could understand something so precise. Madison West High was known for its excellence, at least on paper. The building was new, the students were polished, and the staff hailed from some of the best universities in the country. But beneath the banners and polished mission statements, the school operated on a silent caste system. STEM ruled, humanities followed, and Elijah Brooks, despite his advanced degrees and national speaking credentials, was seen as little more than the black literature guy. His classroom was tucked in the older wing, near the loading dock, away from the bright open concept lounges where the AP Physics and Honors Calculus classes met. He liked it that way, mostly. Fewer interruptions, more space to think. But today, the isolation felt less like sanctuary, and more like exile. He sat behind his desk, a row of student essays still ungraded, and stared at the clock. It ticked with the kind of deliberate rhythm that made his thoughts louder. He opened the drawer to his right, and pulled out an old leather journal. On the inside cover was a scribbled quote from James Baldwin. "Not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it is faced." He turned to a blank page and wrote, "It's not about math, it's about reminding me where I don't belong." He paused, let the weight of that truth settle, then closed the journal. A knock came at the door. It was Rebecca from the history department, a quiet ally who had once brought him soup during flu season. She didn't say anything, just gave a small nod and a look that said, "I saw what happened." That look lingered with him for hours. When the last bell rang, Elijah didn't head home. Instead, he drove east, to the modest brick house he'd grown up in. His mother's place. She had passed 2 years ago, and while he kept the utilities running, the house sat empty, preserved like a museum of his past. He unlocked the door and stepped into a wave of stillness. The same flowered curtains framed the living room window. The same worn couch, the same faded bookshelf filled with Langston Hughes and Toni Morrison. And upstairs, the attic. He hadn't gone up there since the funeral. He climbed the narrow staircase, each step creaking under his weight. A layer of dust coated everything. In the far corner, beneath an old quilt, sat a cardboard box marked in black Sharpie. MIT declined. He knelt and peeled back the tape. The smell of old paper and chalk hit him instantly. Inside were worn notebooks filled with symbols and scribbled proofs, a half-disassembled TI-89 calculator, and at the very bottom, something that stopped his breath. A gold medal, engraved with his name. Elijah A. Brooks, National Mathematics Scholar. He stared at it, unmoving. The shine hadn't faded, neither had the pain. It all came rushing back. 17 years old, standing on stage in Chicago, as the only black finalist in the National Math Invitational. Cameras flashing, reporters smiling, applause crashing around him. And yet, Behind every handshake was suspicion. One judge had murmured, "He's got a gift, but let's see how he holds up at the next level." That next level was MIT. He got in, full scholarship, letters of recommendation so glowing they practically burned through the paper. But then, just days before graduation, Mr. Kellerman, his AP calculus teacher, accused him of cheating on the final, said his answers were too perfect, and didn't reflect his class performance, despite Elijah maintaining a 98 average all year. There was no evidence, no proof, just doubt, and that was enough. The school board launched a quiet review. Word got out. MIT called to discuss the integrity of his transcript. By the time he was cleared, the damage had metastasized. Rumors replaced facts. Celebration turned into silence. And Elijah? He withdrew his admission. Quietly. No press release. No valedictorian speech. Instead, he enrolled at Howard University. Changed majors. Buried the medal. He chose literature because it offered freedom. Not from judgment, but from the illusion of objectivity. Numbers could still lie. But stories? Stories had breath, rage, complexity. They didn't have to prove themselves right. Now, 2 decades later, that medal sat in his palm again. Not as a trophy, but as a wound reopened. He tucked it into his coat pocket. Downstairs, the old rotary phone on the wall rang once. Then stopped. A strange echo in an empty house. He turned on the kitchen light and checked his phone. A new email had arrived. From Principal Hendricks. Subject: Faculty Showcase. Officially scheduled for Friday. Note: this will be a great opportunity for students to witness cross-disciplinary engagement. We expect full attendance. Whitmore had wasted no time. The man wasn't just provoking Elijah. He was framing it as an event. A spectacle. And worse, the administration was already backing it. He sat at the kitchen table and stared at the message. Years ago, he would have walked away. Called in sick. Let it pass. But something had shifted. Maybe it was the quiet rage that still lived under his skin. Maybe it was the knowledge that this wasn't just about him. It was about every student who sat in his class and saw themselves in his eyes. Every black boy in the school who hadn't yet learned that brilliance could be a threat. No, he couldn't walk away. He opened his laptop, pulled up the problem Whitmore had written on the board earlier. He remembered every line of it. Memory worked differently when you'd been solving equations since you were 8. He expanded the integral in his head, dissecting each layer with mechanical precision. It was a trap, deliberately chosen to overwhelm. But the real error wasn't in its difficulty. It was in its arrogance. It assumed Elijah hadn't seen its kind before. He had. He'd seen worse. The quiet fire in his chest was returning. That night, Elijah didn't sleep. He pulled out his old notebooks from the box and flipped through page after page of ancient problem sets. Symbols returned like long-lost languages. It was like riding a bike, if the bike was made of logic and history and scars. Around midnight, he found something he'd forgotten. A note written in the margin of one of his earliest notebooks. Never let them think they taught you your worth. He underlined it 3 times. By morning, he had rewritten Whitmore's entire problem. Then, for his own satisfaction, he added a second version, an elegant variation that included a historical annotation about its origin. The same equation had been explored by black mathematician Euphemia Lofton Haynes. Whitmore would never mention that, but Elijah would. He leaned back in his chair and stared at the ceiling. This wasn't just about solving problems. It was about showing that his intellect didn't need permission to exist. The next day, in the hallway between classes, a student named Marcus approached him. 17, tall, always sat at the back, wore his hoodie like armor. "Mr. Brooks," he said quietly, "they posted something about you on the school subreddit." Elijah opened the app and saw it. Friday Lit versus Math Smackdown. Can Mr. Poetry do math? Dozens of laughing emojis. Underneath, a single comment stood out. I heard he used to be some kind of math genius. But they buried it. He didn't respond. He just smiled. A quiet, knowing smile. Elijah holds the gold medal again for the first time in decades. His past, the one they tried to erase, is about to walk back into the light. On the surface, Professor Charles Whitmore was the poster child of academic prestige. Oxford educated, a recipient of the National STEM Educator Fellowship, and Madison West's reigning icon of mathematical excellence for over a decade. His office walls were littered with framed degrees, plaques, and group photos with visiting scholars. Yet for all the credentials he carried, There was something brittle about the man, something brittle and calculated. Behind his silver-rimmed glasses and crisp diction was an obsessive need to assert dominance, not just in mathematics, but in who got to claim intelligence at all. The challenge he issued to Elijah Brooks wasn't a spontaneous move. It had been weeks in the making. In fact, 2 weeks prior, Whitmore had been in a closed-door meeting with Superintendent Glass and several board members. The meeting was labeled as a budget discussion, but Whitmore had a different agenda. "I'm concerned," he had said, pacing slowly in front of a pie chart showing department funding, "that we're bending too far toward this new wave of inclusivity, equity grants, interdisciplinary proposals. There's talk of rebalancing the funding model next semester. It's dangerous." One board member, Ms. Langston, had asked, "Dangerous how?" Whitmore had smiled tightly. "When we begin equating interpretive disciplines with empirical ones, we dilute academic rigor. Literature is important, yes, but it cannot be measured in the same way. And if we start distributing funds based on social narratives instead of measurable outcomes, we compromise excellence." Glass had tried to steer the meeting back to data, but the seed had been planted. Whitmore knew how to play the long game, and that meant undermining Elijah Brooks publicly, intellectually, and most of all, symbolically. Back in his office, Whitmore crafted the challenge with careful precision. He selected problems that would play not just to his own strengths, but to Elijah's likely weaknesses. It wasn't about solving, it was about discrediting. He knew exactly how the staff would react. He knew which ones would laugh, which would nod silently, and which would pretend neutrality, while privately cheering for his victory. And the students? They'd see it as entertainment. The optics were perfect. A proud math professor versus the poetic lit teacher. Science versus softness. Logic versus emotion. What he didn't expect, not truly, was the way Elijah had spotted the flaw in his first problem. That moment had irked him, not because he believed Elijah couldn't solve it, but because Elijah hadn't folded, hadn't stammered or shrugged, or walked away. Instead, he'd calmly pointed out the error. That wasn't part of the script. By Thursday, Whitmore was back in his office, tightening the next problem set. This time, he left nothing open for debate. But just before lunch, his assistant, Melinda, a sharp, observant woman in her late 20s, hesitated at his door. "You wanted me to print your notes for the board meeting tomorrow," she said. He nodded. "Leave them on my desk." She lingered. "Professor, may I ask something?" Whitmore looked up, mildly annoyed. "Of course. Do you think this exhibition is really necessary?" He raised an eyebrow. "It's healthy academic discourse. But Brooks teaches literature. This feels skewed." Whitmore's smile didn't reach his eyes. "The integrity of our curriculum must be defended. That's not skewed. That's leadership." Melinda nodded, but her silence held something else. As she left, Whitmore returned to his computer. He opened his drafts folder. Inside was a message he had written, but not yet sent to select department chairs. "We can't let these narratives redefine excellence. This is a moment to remind the literature folks where the real intellect lies." He hadn't meant to send it, not yet. But while reviewing his notes later that evening, he accidentally hit the wrong button. The email was sent to all faculty, and within minutes, the school's unofficial internal Slack lit up with fire. Did he just say that out loud? Yo, someone screenshot that before he deletes it. This feels like 1952 with Wi-Fi. Elijah was still on campus, staying late to meet with a student when his phone buzzed. 10 messages in a row. The screenshot was everywhere. He read it twice, then sat still. It wasn't surprising. It wasn't even new. But it was proof that this wasn't about calculus. It was about control. About putting him back in his place. Principal Hendricks called a hasty emergency meeting that night. Half the staff didn't show. Those who did sat quietly, as Whitmore defended himself. It was a private draft, not meant to be shared. "That doesn't make it less racist," someone said quietly from the back. "I stand by the importance of standards," Whitmore said stiffly. "But if offense was taken, I regret that." No apology. Just regret that people had reacted. Elijah, who'd chosen to listen without speaking, finally stood. "You didn't send an accident. You revealed an attitude." Whitmore didn't look at him. He simply gathered his notes and left the room. By morning, the story had leaked. An anonymous student posted the screenshot on Reddit. Then it hit Twitter. Then a local education blog. The headline read, "Prestigious high school rocked by internal faculty email." The comments were brutal. So this is what excellence looks like. Imagine the message this sends to black students. Math supremacy is alive and well. And just like that, the quiet intellectual ambush became a public scandal. Students began organizing. Some created flyers for the Friday event, now calling it the showdown. Others made memes. A few made signs. But in the margins, there was still fear. Elijah knew how this worked. Outrage burned fast, and then disappeared. But institutional protection lasted generations. That night he received an email from a former student. She was now a second-year law student at Howard. I remember when I used to think I wasn't smart enough for debate club. You told me intellect isn't about sounding right. It's about standing in the truth. This week I watched your truth shake the room. He reread it 4 times. Then, another message came in. This one from a blocked address. Subject: stay in your lane. Message: you make one mistake Friday, and they'll bury you. Again. No signature. No threats. Just intent. He closed the laptop. Outside, rain began to fall against the windows. The kind of rain that made the world sound quieter than it really was. He sat in the dark, knowing this wasn't just about math anymore. It was about history. And history always repeated. Unless someone rewrote it.
Whitmore's private email leaks. Let's remind the literature folks where the real intellect lies.
The morning after Whitmore's email leaked, the Madison West Staff Lounge was no longer neutral ground. It was a battlefield. Elijah entered quietly, the hum of tension hanging thick in the air. Normally filled with idle chatter and the clinking of spoons in ceramic mugs, today it was dead silent. He crossed the room without looking at anyone, set down his thermos, and retrieved his notebook. But he felt it. The side eyes, the 2 long glances, the hushed conversations that stalled the moment he passed. The line had been drawn. Not just between 2 men, but between 2 departments, between 2 ideologies, between 2 versions of what intelligence looked like, and who was allowed to own it. Across the room, Whitmore was perched on the far end of the table, surrounded by his usual entourage of math and science faculty. Danielle from physics sat stiffly beside him. Todd from chemistry leaned back, arms crossed, eyes cool. It was tribal now, and Elijah knew it. No one dared speak first. But the silence cracked when Monica Lang, a senior English teacher, walked in mid-conversation on her phone. She stopped short, sensing the freeze. "Everything all right?" she asked, glancing between the 2 ends of the room. No one answered, not directly. But Whitmore raised his mug slightly, in a gesture that meant nothing and everything. Elijah finally looked up. "They're just deciding who gets to own intelligence this week," he said calmly.
That did it.
Danielle stood up. "No one said you didn't belong here, Elijah." "No," Elijah replied. "You just laughed when someone tried to erase me with calculus." Todd smirked. "No one's erasing anyone. You're blowing this out of proportion." "Am I?" Elijah's voice was low but firm. "Because I read the email. The one that said let's remind the literature folks where the real intellect lies. You don't get it." Danielle snapped. "He didn't mean you. He meant the funding conversations. The curriculum shifts. This isn't personal." "Everything is personal," Monica said sharply, stepping between them. "Especially when the only black male teacher in this building is being publicly challenged and privately insulted." Whitmore finally spoke. Calm as always. "I stand by what I said. We've lost academic discipline. Emotion has taken the place of logic. And I, for one, believe students deserve more." "More of what?" Elijah asked, rising now. "More white saviors telling them what counts as real learning. More erasure of their stories, their identities." "You're twisting this," Whitmore said, growing colder. "I never made this about race." "You didn't have to," Elijah replied. "That's the privilege, isn't it? You get to pretend it's just about merit, while ignoring the systems that were never built for people like me to succeed." A few faculty members shifted uncomfortably. Whitmore stood slowly. "Let's be clear. You're not under attack. You were invited to a scholarly demonstration, an invitation you only made after planting a trap in a room full of people who already doubt I belong." Elijah said. "This wasn't about collaboration. This was about control." Silence. In the back, Sarah from the art department slowly pulled out her phone. She didn't say a word. She just hit record. The argument was unfolding like a slow-motion disaster, and no one was stopping it. "You've always had a chip on your shoulder," Todd muttered. "Maybe that's the problem." Elijah's jaw tightened. "Do you think I want to walk into rooms like this and carry the burden of being the only one who looks like me?" You think I enjoy being the one they ask to explain every cultural issue, every equity policy, every quote from Baldwin? Gentlemen, Monica tried to interject. Elijah held up a hand. No. Let it be said. Out loud. For one. His voice dropped into something deeper. Not louder, heavier. Every time I succeed, someone wonders who helped me. Every time I push back, I'm too sensitive, too political, too angry. So when I walk in here and dismantle a calculus problem, I'm not being a scholar. I'm being uppity. I'm stepping out of line. Enough, Whitmore said, finally losing some of his polish. You've turned this into a theater. No, Elijah said. You did the moment you made my intellect a spectacle. The room froze. Sarah stopped recording. She didn't say why. Later that day, students began whispering about a video circulating. First on group chats, then on private Instagram stories. A few reposted it to Snapchat. By nightfall, it hit Twitter. The caption was simple. Black teacher checks racist math debt at staff meeting. By morning, the clip had 50,000 views. A faculty member anonymously leaks footage of the confrontation to students. And the clip goes viral overnight. Elijah barely made it through his Friday morning classes. Students stared longer than usual. Some nodded with respect. A few whispered as he passed. He said nothing. His focus was elsewhere. The leaked video had crossed 80,000 views by the time second period ended. The comment sections had exploded with both support and venom. One post read, "This is why they need to stick to their own subjects." Another said, "He's the kind of teacher that made me feel seen." Elijah didn't respond to any of it. Not to the praise, and certainly not to the threats. He kept his head down, finished roll call, and answered questions on Baldwin's The Fire Next Time, like nothing had changed. But everything had. At 12:15 p.m., he received a text. In town. Outside the school. Can we talk? Elijah's heart stalled. AR. Only one person signed text that way. Dr. Arthur Rowe. His old math coach. His mentor. The man who had once called him a walking theorem. Elijah hadn't seen him in over 12 years. He texted back a room number, and 10 minutes later, Rowe entered, still wearing the navy wool overcoat. Elijah remembered. His hair was grayer, his gait a little slower, but his eyes still sharp, still studying everything. Elijah, he said with a hint of the same tone he used back when he'd prepare him for national math tournaments. Why do I feel like you're about to relive the worst decision of your life? Elijah chuckled, then sighed. You always did skip the small talk. Rowe sat across from him. You look tired. I've been in a battle I didn't start. You're in a battle you swore you'd never go back to. Elijah nodded. I didn't plan it. It found me. Rowe folded his hands. You still remember what happened the last time, right? What it cost you. The silence that followed was its own kind of answer. Rowe glanced around the room. You used to talk about teaching math to kids who looked like you. Then you pivoted. Literature. Identity, pain. You became brilliant at telling the stories they never let you write as equations. Elijah looked down. I didn't stop doing math. I just stopped trusting who was allowed to see me doing it. You were hurt, Rowe said gently. You were wronged. But the world you're about to walk back into, it's not gentler now. It's smarter. It's colder. They'll play this on two fronts. Challenge your intellect and dismiss your anger. I know. You're walking into a trap. Then I'll walk in with my eyes open. Rowe leaned forward. That's what scares me. Elijah sat with that. Then he asked, why did you come? Rowe paused, then pulled out a worn envelope. Inside, a yellowed letter of offer. Because I found this last week while cleaning out my office, he said. You never picked it up. He slid it across the table. Elijah opened it. The header read, Massachusetts Institute of Technology, Fellowship Award. I thought I burned this, Elijah whispered. Rowe smiled sadly. You should have framed it. The memory crashed back. The investigation. The whisper campaign. The way the school board quietly pulled back their support after the accusation, even after it was disproven. The silence from MIT once the scandal spread. The fellowship had arrived late, like an afterthought. But Elijah never cashed it in. He folded the letter. You think I made a mistake? Rowe shook his head. I think you survived something no one should have had to. But now you're walking back into fire. And I need you to know they will not play fair. I don't expect them to. Rowe stood. Then promise me one thing. Don't let their rules dictate your worth. Use your mind. Use your story. But never confuse proving yourself with explaining yourself. You don't owe them clarity. Elijah stood too. I'm not doing this to be accepted. I'm doing it because kids need to see what it looks like to stand tall after they've tried to bury you. Rose stared at him for a long moment, then nodded once. I'll be in the crowd, he said. He left without another word. That night, Elijah sat at his kitchen table and unfolded the fellowship letter again. He placed it beside the gold medal from 2003. The two artifacts, one of achievement, the other of loss, sat like puzzle pieces from a past no one ever bothered to ask him about. He had been chosen, then he had been discarded. Now he had returned. And this time, he wasn't leaving quietly. He opened his laptop. For the first time since he was 17, he typed his own name into an academic journal database. It pulled up his winning competition submission from the national finals, parametric modeling through nonlinear constraints. He had forgotten how elegant it was, not the math but the language of it. It read like poetry, precision disguised as rhythm. And then for reasons he couldn't explain, he searched Whitmore. What he found made him lean back. Whitmore had never published a single paper in a peer-reviewed journal. Not one. A handful of blogs, guest lectures, conference panels. But nothing substantive. Elijah, at 17, had contributed more academically than the man claiming to represent real intellect. He laughed. Not because it was funny, because it was absurd. By morning he had created a folder labeled Showdown Prep. Inside he built side-by-side files, one with Whitmore's likely problem types. The other? His own. Literary challenges that embedded mathematical logic into historical analysis. If Whitmore wanted rigor, Elijah would deliver it, just not in the language he expected. Saturday came. Elijah was walking through the local farmer's market when a voice called out, "Mr. Brooks?" He turned. A woman in her 30s, holding a toddler. "You probably don't remember me. I'm Dana Carter, class of..." Elijah smiled. "Dana, of course I remember you. You wrote the piece on Zora Neale Hurston that had the whole class debating for 2 days." She beamed. "That class changed everything for me. I'm in publishing now. But I saw the video, and the comments. People can be so..." She trailed off, glancing at her child. Elijah nodded. "They can." She hesitated. "I just want you to know, there are so many of us who saw you. Back then, and now, you gave us permission to be complicated, brilliant, angry, and proud." He didn't know what to say, so he just said thank you. Later that night he reread Rose's letter again. Then he made a decision. He scanned the fellowship and uploaded it. Caption: "They offered me this after they almost let a lie destroy me. I said no then. I say no now to every system that demands silence, as the cost of excellence." By morning it had 10,000 retweets. The mentor reveals something stunning. Elijah once turned down an MIT fellowship after a racist scandal. By Monday morning, Madison West High felt like a war zone wrapped in silence. The viral clip had torn the facade off the school's polished image, and though no one spoke it directly, every student, teacher, and administrator could feel the shift, like stepping into a room just after a shouting match. The halls were quiet, but not calm. They buzzed with tension. Students had begun taking sides. Some did it openly. Others moved quietly. The school's social order, never truly neutral, fractured along familiar lines. Race, curriculum, reputation. On the second floor, math club members sat in a tight circle, typing furious replies to comments on Reddit threads that now dissected the school's racial politics like an open wound. One senior, Nick, wore a shirt with equations printed across the chest, and the phrase "facts over feelings." Downstairs, the lit crew huddled in Elijah's classroom during lunch. Posters of Baldwin and Hurston watched over them. Olivia, a junior who once barely spoke in class, now led the conversation. "They think this is just about math," she said, "but it's about who they think owns intelligence." Jamal chimed in, eyes sharp. "And who they think doesn't deserve it. This is about respect, not equations." It wasn't just rhetoric. Students were organizing. Someone had launched a website titled The Real Madison West. It documented faculty diversity stats, anonymous student testimonies, clips of previous incidents swept under the rug. Each page opened with a quote from Elijah's viral speech, "You don't get to make my intellect a spectacle." By midweek, hallway walls were dotted with sharp dueling messages. Defend STEM. Real skills, real jobs. No formula measures our fire. Principal Hendricks issued a vague morning announcement. Let's remember we are one community. But it sounded like surrender, not guidance. The students didn't stop. Marcus, normally reserved, started writing spoken word pieces in his notebook. His latest one began, "They say stay in your lane. I say build new roads." That same day, a guidance counselor forwarded Elijah an email. Multiple parents had requested their children be removed from his class, citing increased emotional instability in the classroom. Elijah read the message, then deleted it. He told himself not to care. He failed. That night, a Lit Crew student, Alicia, sent him a screenshot. The math club had created a private Discord channel. A former member had leaked it. In it, students mocked the Lit Crew's emotional tone, called their TikToks performance art, laughed about how the English teacher can't take a challenge without crying about slavery. One comment read, "Watch him melt when he sees the next problem set." Elijah closed the file. He knew what was coming. Whitmore would not just try to win, he would try to humiliate him. Still, Elijah refused to coach his students into outrage. Instead, he prepared them with truth. Brilliance doesn't require anyone's permission, he told his class. But silence is what systems count on. If you're tired, rest. If you're afraid, speak anyway. And if you're angry, know you're not alone. They listened. Some cried. One whispered, "Thank you." The next morning, Elijah arrived early. The windows in his classroom were fogged by the cold. He set his thermos on the desk, unzipped his bag, and pulled out his copy of Invisible Man. But when he turned to write the day's prompt on the whiteboard, he froze. There, taped to the center, was a note. Clean, plain font. White paper. No handwriting. "Stay in your lane, or we'll put you back in it." Elijah stared at it, not with fear, but with clarity. They weren't just challenging his mind now. They were trying to erase his presence. A threatening note appears in Elijah's classroom. "Stay in your lane, or we'll put you back in it." The note had been brief, blunt, taped dead center on Elijah's whiteboard like a dare. "Stay in your lane, or we'll put you back in it." He hadn't shown anyone, not his students, not Principal Hendricks, not even Dr. Rowe, who had been checking in by text every other day. Elijah knew what it meant. Not just the threat, the timing of it, because by now the story had gone national. The video of the staff room confrontation, now dubbed the Chalkboard Challenge, had crossed over 2 million views across platforms. It had been clipped, captioned, misquoted, stitched into reaction videos by influencers, debated on cable news, and reshaped into something far more viral and far more dangerous than the truth. That was the thing about the internet. It didn't care about accuracy. It cared about friction. And Elijah's existence was friction. It began with a tweet. A former student had posted the video with a caption, "This is my old English teacher, Elijah Brooks, being a genius and dismantling racism in real time. I'd follow this man into any battle." The tweet was shared by a prominent Black author, then by a civil rights group, then by a celebrity, who captioned it simply this. Within 24 hours, Elijah's name was trending. At first it was uplifting. The comments were flooded with love. Finally a teacher speaking up. Representation matters. So does truth. They're lucky to have him. But as always, the light drew shadows. Anonymous accounts flooded the threads with counter-narratives. Another overhyped DI puppet. "Stick to your slam poetry, professor." Of course the English teacher is black and angry. Then the digging began. Internet sleuths pulled up Elijah's old LinkedIn, his alma maters. The fact that he had switched majors in college. One blog speculated that he had only gotten into MIT as a diversity candidate. Another questioned why someone that gifted would ever leave the math world for literature unless he had something to hide. Elijah tried to block it out. He turned off notifications, deleted Twitter, logged off Facebook. But it didn't matter. The algorithm had tasted blood, and now it was feeding on his life. On YouTube, a conservative commentator posted a 10-minute breakdown titled, "Elijah Brooks Woke Hero or Calculated Opportunist." The video accused him of weaponizing race, of creating division, of performing grievance for clout. It had 500,000 views by the end of the day. His email inbox became a battlefield. Messages poured in by the hundreds. "Thank you for standing up. You're an inspiration to my son. We need more teachers like you." But wedged between those were the others. "You are the cancer of education. We're watching you. Hope your school burns." He read them, then stopped. But it didn't matter. Because then came the calls. His classroom voicemail filled up twice in one day. He played one by accident. Elijah Brooks. We know your type. Loud, fake, and always the victim. Can't wait to see you get put back in your place, boy. He deleted it, but his hands shook. The next morning, he arrived to find a small gathering outside the school. Protesters. Half a dozen people, mostly middle-aged, all white, held signs that read, "Protect education, not indoctrination. No to reverse racism." Principal Hendricks met him at the door. "Elijah, the district's been flooded with complaints," she said. "Emails, voicemails, even a letter to the board." He stared past her, at the picket signs. "Are they here for me?" "They say they're here for academic integrity," she said. "But we both know what that means." She hesitated. "There's something else." He followed her into her office. On her desk was a package. Manila envelope. No return address. "It came this morning," she said. "No one saw who dropped it off." Elijah opened it. Inside was a printed PDF. Clean. High resolution. His disciplinary record. Not from Madison West. From 20 years ago. His first teaching job in Georgia. The incident that had nearly ended his career. The one he had buried. The folder included a formal warning letter from the district. A student complaint, later proven unfounded. A notation. Fails to collaborate with colleagues. And a yellow post-it note stuck to the top. Some things don't change. Should have stuck to fiction. His chest went hollow. "Who knew about this?" he asked quietly. Hendricks was pale. "Only HR. And someone had to dig deep." That file was sealed. Elijah stared at the papers. He hadn't seen them in years. He had been 24. New to teaching. New to systems. He had questioned a policy, suggested curriculum changes, spoken up when he saw a black student unfairly disciplined. He wasn't loud, just present. And that had been enough. The student complaint had been flimsy, withdrawn later, but the district had still written him up, called him uncooperative, marked him as difficult. It hadn't ruined him, but it followed him. Until now, until someone decided to weaponize it. "I'm sorry," Hendricks said softly. "We'll investigate." Elijah didn't answer. He left her office, closed his classroom door, sat at his desk, and stared, not at the papers, at the space between them. Because that space, that gap, was where so many black educators lived. Not in scandal, but in suspicion. The line between confidence and arrogance, between leadership and threat, between intellect and insubordination. He breathed. Long, deep, measured. Then he took out his phone, opened the camera, photographed the folder, posted it. Caption: "They said I failed to collaborate." What they meant was, I didn't stay quiet. Within an hour, it had 50,000 likes. Then came the DM. Other black teachers, from Ohio, Texas, California, dozens of them. "Same thing happened to me. I have a file too." They called me intimidating in a parent report. For raising my hand. Elijah felt something shift. Not rage, alignment. Because this wasn't just his story. It never had been. And he was done playing defense. Elijah receives an anonymous package with a copy of his disciplinary record from 20 years ago. The classroom had become his refuge, and his proving ground. Elijah stayed late every night that week. The students had long gone, the fluorescent lights hummed overhead, and the halls outside his door stood still, empty, waiting. The world beyond Madison West was spiraling in headlines and hashtags, but inside this room, this one room, Elijah began returning to something he hadn't touched in years. Math. Not metaphorical math. Not curriculum math. Real math. Deep math. It had been nearly 15 years since he last cracked open a calculus textbook with intent. Since he last solved equations not because someone challenged his worth, but because he wanted to. But now, as he sat in silence with his notes, the discipline came back like muscle memory. Clumsy at first, then fluid, then hungry. He dug out his old notebooks, long buried in a box beside the gold medal. Pages filled with scrawled derivations, and unfinished problem sets from a life that had nearly been erased. He flipped through them slowly, reading not just the numbers but the margins. The questions he asked himself in ink. What does it mean to prove truth in a world that lies about people like me? He began each evening with warm-ups, derivatives, graph transformations, limits. But by Tuesday, he was challenging himself with second-order differential equations, complex integrals, optimization problems with multiple constraints. The kind of problems you don't solve, unless you want to feel your brain stretch. But this wasn't just about preparation. It was about reclamation. Each solved equation felt like pulling back a piece of himself. Each scribbled proof was a reclamation of a mind too long boxed into literature because someone once decided math belonged to someone else. But the stakes were different now. Whitmore's problems wouldn't be just difficult. They'd be performative, designed to disorient, crafted to prove a point not just about logic, but about who gets to own logic. Elijah knew this, knew he wasn't preparing for a test. He was preparing for a spectacle. And still, he worked. 3 days in, he built himself a mock-up whiteboard using foam boards taped together at the front of the classroom. He brought in markers from home. Black, red, blue, colors that helped him track his own thinking. He began pacing as he solved, retraining his muscle memory to perform as much as prove. On Thursday, while solving a particularly brutal integral triple-nested nonlinear, he paused halfway through and began working backwards from the answer. He wanted to check for symmetry, but as he wrote, something else happened. A student had wandered in. It was Marcus. Elijah didn't notice him at first. He was deep in the math, muttering to himself, flipping through identities, switching colors for clarity. He erased 3 lines, rewrote them, stepped back. That's when he saw the light, the reflection of a phone, tucked low in Marcus's hand. He froze. Marcus stepped forward quickly. I didn't mean to. Elijah stared at him. Marcus looked sheepish. It was beautiful. What? Elijah asked, half laughing.
The way you solved that backwards. No notes. Like it was music.
Elijah blinked. You understood that. Not all of it, Marcus admitted. But I recognized the pattern. You used symmetry to collapse the loop. Elijah felt his chest tighten. You've been paying attention? Marcus shrugged. I've been watching you. Not like in class. Out here. Since it started. I didn't know you could do this. Elijah smiled gently. They made me forget I could. Marcus hesitated. Can I show the video to the lit crew? Elijah considered. Let me see it first. Marcus handed him the phone. The video was short, no more than 40 seconds. But it captured everything. Elijah's calm focus. His silent precision. The way he turned a wall of chaos into elegant flow. Upload it, Elijah said. Marcus's eyes widened. You sure? Yes. Let them see who they're up against. By that night, the clip was online. No hashtags, no captions, just Mr. Brooks. Within an hour, it had 3,000 views. By morning, it had... The comments flooded in. Wait. He solved that? Backwards. With no notes. While talking. This man ain't just a lit teacher. He's a quiet storm.
The school buzzed with it.
Whitmore saw it. Of course he did. By Friday, he had revised the entire problem set he planned to give Elijah during the public challenge. He couldn't risk being outshined by elegance. Meanwhile, Elijah continued preparing. But now he added something else. He pulled out literary texts, Baldwin, Morrison, Ellison, and created problem sets inspired by them. Not just quotes or themes, but layered exercises, where the structure of a novel became the variable of a function, where a metaphor became the unknown. Because when the time came, he wouldn't just solve Whitmore's problems. He'd present his own. On Friday afternoon, Principal Hendricks walked into the classroom just as Elijah was finishing a derivation. She watched him in silence, then asked, You ready? He looked at the board, then at her. I'm not sure ready is the word. She nodded. I saw the clip. He arched an eyebrow. She continued. And I saw the old file. The one they sent you. I want you to know. I've contacted the district, demanded a formal review. That record should have stayed sealed. Elijah said nothing, but something in his face softened. Then she asked, Can I stay? He tilted his head. For the session? For the prep? I won't interrupt. I want to see. He nodded, and with Hendricks seated in the back, Elijah picked up the marker and began again. This time, with an audience. A student quietly records him solving an impossible integral backwards. The video of Elijah solving an impossible integral backward had changed the school's atmosphere, but not in the way most expected. For the lit crew and Elijah's quiet supporters, it was electric validation, proof that their teacher was more than the box they'd tried to fit him into. For the math club and Whitmore's inner circle, however, it wasn't inspiration, it was ammunition. Because now the challenge mattered even more. Whitmore, never one to be outshined twice, called a closed-door meeting with the STEM department and 2 school board members. No agenda, no minutes, Just an unrecorded conversation. And a new proposal. He smiled through it. As always. We can't let a momentary emotional reaction from the student body shape how this institution measures excellence, he said. And what do you suggest? One board member asked. Arms crossed. A formal setting, Whitmore replied. An intellectual exhibition. Structured, fair, public. If Mr. Brooks is as capable as they say, it should be no problem. The proposal was clear. A public academic showdown. One challenge. One problem. Each man would solve one another's problem. But Whitmore added something more. If Mr. Brooks fails, he said, his department should be realigned. Resources matter. If we're reallocating prestige, we should reallocate funding too. The room was quiet. You're suggesting we punish a department over a math problem? Someone finally asked. Whitmore raised a brow. I'm suggesting we align resources with demonstrated rigor. By the end of the hour, the board agreed. On paper, it was a friendly exhibition. In practice, it was war. Elijah was called into Principal Hendricks's office the next morning. She looked exhausted. They approved it, she said flatly. What exactly? Elijah asked. The challenge. Public. Next Friday. Auditorium. Students will attend. Press will be outside. Each of you presents a problem. Each solves the others. It's being billed as a cross-disciplinary celebration of intellect. Elijah sighed. And if I fail, they're calling it a review. But if you don't succeed, the board is considering reallocating half the literature department's funding to STEM. He blinked. That's absurd. It's strategic, she corrected. They're betting on embarrassment. They want to gut your department, with the appearance of fairness. He stood. So it's a trap. She didn't argue. By lunch, the student body knew. Posters appeared across campus. Digital flyers were circulated. Math visas lit. The showdown. Friday. Auditorium. 11. Elijah watched it all unfold with a numb kind of clarity. The next day, Whitmore stopped by Elijah's classroom. He didn't enter. Just leaned on the doorway, smile like a blade. Quite the buzz, he said. I'm impressed with how you've energized the students. Elijah looked up from his desk. Didn't realize I had to energize them. Thought I just had to teach them. Whitmore chuckled. Yes. Well, some of us are educators. Others, performers. Elijah stood. Let's see who performs next Friday. Whitmore nodded, eyes narrowing. Indeed. And then, in a tone just soft enough to be sinister, he added, bring your best. It would be a shame if the poetry club had to meet in a broom closet. That night, Elijah didn't sleep. He worked. He refined his problem, polished the framing, made it elegant, yes, but also poetic, layered with nuance, built on literary structure, but hiding logic within metaphor, a kind of bridge between two worlds. Meanwhile, Marcus and the lit crew prepared too. They planned a support campaign. Posters, ribbons, t-shirts. One design read, "Books don't back down." By Thursday, the auditorium was being rearranged. 2 podiums, 2 whiteboards, 2 men, 1 moment. The students buzzed with tension, half excited, half nervous, all aware they were watching something much bigger than a math challenge. Elijah stood alone, that evening in the empty auditorium, staring at the stage. The space felt cavernous, silent, like a waiting jury. And then from the shadows, Marcus stepped in. He walked up to the stage and pulled something from his backpack. It was a framed quote from James Baldwin. You have to decide who you are and force the world to deal with that, not with its idea of you. Marcus handed it to him. Elijah didn't speak. He just nodded, because he knew tomorrow wasn't about solving a problem. It was about making them see who he had always been. The school board approves the challenge as a friendly intellectual exhibition, broadcast to the entire school. Friday arrived with an eerie quiet. Madison West High felt less like a school and more like a stage. By 8 a.m., staff scrambled to manage the logistics. A local news crew was already stationed outside the main entrance. Students gathered in clumps, hushed, dressed in lit crew shirts or math club hoodies. The sides were drawn, but no one dared speak the tension aloud. By 10:30 a.m., the auditorium was packed. Every seat filled. Students, faculty, a few board members, parents, even community members squeezed into the back. 2 whiteboards stood center stage. 2 podiums, 2 markers, 2 chairs, 1 clock. Elijah stood backstage, breathing slowly. He had reviewed the rules. Each participant would present one problem, rooted in their respective discipline, but solvable with interdisciplinary logic. The other would solve it, live. No calculators, no hints, no redo. Elijah wasn't nervous. He was anchored. Marcus appeared beside him, holding the framed Baldwin quote. "For good luck," he said. Elijah smiled. "Thank you." Across the auditorium, Whitmore adjusted his tie and smirked at the cameras. Principal Hendricks took the mic at center stage. "Welcome everyone," she began. "Today you will witness something rare. Not just a test of knowledge, but of humility, courage, and complexity. This is not about who wins. It's about what it means to be brilliant in different ways." A polite applause. Then Whitmore stepped forward. "I'll go first," he said. He turned to the whiteboard and began writing. Confident strokes. Methodical. The room fell dead silent. The problem grew line by line. A deeply nested integral involving trigonometric identities, advanced limits, and complex boundary conditions. Elijah studied it. It was solvable but time-consuming. Intentionally so. Whitmore capped the marker and stepped back.
Mr. Brooks, he said with a condescending smile, whenever you're ready.
Elijah approached the board, took the marker. Breathe. Then he started. His approach wasn't flashy. It was clear, efficient. He rewrote the function, simplified it, broke it into parts. He didn't speak, just work. 10 minutes in, a gasp from the crowd. He had bypassed 2 unnecessary steps with a shortcut Whitmore hadn't considered. 15 minutes later, he boxed the final answer. Applause erupted. Even some of the math club students clapped. Elijah turned to Whitmore. "My turn." He erased the board and began his own problem. But it didn't look like math. At first it looked like poetry. A quote from Toni Morrison. A narrative about migration patterns. An allegory of exponential decay.
Then the equation revealed itself.
Hidden in metaphor. The variables danced with meaning. It was mathematics' story. Whitmore's smile faded. He stepped up and began. He worked faster than Elijah. Precise, robotic, aggressive. But something wasn't landing. 10 minutes in, he paused. 15 minutes in, he erased 2 lines. He scratched his head. Started again. The clock ticked. Murmurs spread across the room. Whitmore's expression darkened. He stepped back. "This equation is flawed," he announced. "It's unsolvable by standard calculus methods." Gasps. He turned to Elijah. "You embedded contradiction into the logic. This isn't fair." Elijah, calm, walked to the board. He picked up the marker. "Incorrect," he said. "You assumed the function was closed. But if you reframe it as a discrete approximation over shifting parameters, it simplifies." He rewrote 2 lines. The board lit up with clarity. The answer appeared. The room exploded in applause. Whitmore's face flushed red. But before the noise could settle, Whitmore raised his hand. "I'd like to propose an additional challenge," he said. The room quieted. He stepped to his podium and pulled out a sealed envelope. This was prepared independently by the board. An elite-level problem not seen by either of us. Let this be the tiebreaker. Elijah hesitated. Principal Hendricks approached. "It's true." The board approved it as a neutral measure. 1 problem, 1 shot. Whitmore opened the envelope. He stepped to the board and began to write. Elijah's heart dropped. The problem wasn't just complex. It was impossible, under standard rules. It defied solvability without obscure theoretical knowledge. Whitmore stepped back. "If you're as brilliant as they claim, solve it." Elijah stepped forward. His hand trembled slightly. He stared at the equation. Then slowly, he picked up the marker. He began to write. Whitmore reveals he's modified the equation. It's now unsolvable using traditional methods. The marker in Elijah's hand didn't just represent a writing tool. It carried weight, generations of expectation, humiliation, and silent resistance. Whitmore's equation loomed large on the board, a maze of notation that seemed on the surface to challenge intellect. But as Elijah studied it, line by line, he saw something else beneath the complexity: intention. He could see it in the structure, how the variables collapsed, meaning, how the boundaries contradicted each other, in subtle ways, how the nested limits didn't just frustrate solution, but blocked it. He realized Whitmore hadn't created a challenge. He had created a trap. Elijah stood there for a full minute, then 2. The auditorium held its breath. Phones hovered. Live streams ticked into the tens of thousands. The lit crew watched with wide eyes. The math club, Silent began to look uncertain. Principal Hendricks sat motionless at the edge of the stage, fists tight in her lap. Then, without saying a word, Elijah circled 3 parts of the problem. Carefully, deliberately, he placed the marker down, turned to the audience. "This isn't a math problem," he said. The auditorium stirred. "It's a performance," Elijah continued. "A manufactured contradiction. It looks complex, sounds advanced, but it was designed to mislead, designed to eat time, to create failure, not from lack of skill, but from choosing the wrong rules." He gestured to the board. "The contradiction here is intentional. The assumptions are unstable. This problem doesn't measure intelligence. It rewards familiarity with trickery." He paused. "And if that sounds familiar to you, a hush fell. "Because that's how systems work. Especially racist ones." Gasps. "You ask a black teacher to solve a problem designed to humiliate him. You rig the conditions. You bake in assumptions about time, about language, about approach, and then you declare failure when we don't solve it the way you want." Whitmore rose slightly in his seat. "This problem isn't difficult," Elijah said. "It's dishonest." He turned back to the board, picked up the eraser, and wiped it clean. All of it. Then he picked up a marker and began writing again. But this time, the problem unfolded differently. He began with a narrative, a word problem, but rooted in real history. Black migration patterns over decades, tied to economic decay and resurgence. He overlaid it with statistics, built the curve from first principles, then nested it in a matrix. It wasn't just math, it was lived experience as math. And then he rewrote the structure Whitmore had intended, only this time, with clarity. He made it solvable, but not simple. It still required deep thought, still required process, still rewarded insight, and he solved it, line by line. The students were silent, only the sound of marker on board. And when he boxed the final answer, it wasn't with triumph, it was with dignity. He turned back to the audience. "I didn't beat the problem," he said. "I replaced it, because sometimes, the only way to win is not to play their game, but to name it, and build your own." Then he stepped away. Silence. Then one clap. Marcus. Then another. Olivia. Then the lit crew. Then the entire auditorium. A standing ovation. Students. Teachers. Some members of the board. Only Whitmore sat still, face pale, eyes hard. Principal Hendricks stepped up to the mic, voice shaky. "Elijah Brooks has reminded us today that brilliance isn't just about answers. It's about the courage to question the rules of the test." Applause again. Then a sharp voice rose from the front row. "Board member Allen, we need to convene," she said, standing. "Effective immediately." Heads turned. "For what?" Hendricks asked. "A closed session," Allen said. "The events of today warrant serious review. There are implications." They left the auditorium. Students whispered. Phones flashed. Tension hung heavy. Elijah remained on stage. The board erased, but a new idea left glowing in its place. Whitmore passed him on the way out, eyes avoiding his. But Elijah didn't move, because for the first time in years he wasn't the one under review. Gasps fill the room. The Board of Education demands a closed-door meeting. The board's closed-door meeting lasted nearly 2 hours. While they deliberated, Elijah sat in the empty auditorium. The students had long filed out. Whitmore was gone. Only Principal Hendricks remained, pacing quietly near the edge of the stage, her heels echoing like a metronome. Elijah didn't speak. His hands were clasped in front of him, eyes steady on the whiteboard. The problem he had created still glowed faintly in the dim stage lights. It wasn't just a solution. It was a confrontation with history. At 3:06 p.m., the side door creaked open. Board member Allen stepped out, followed by 2 others. Their faces looked flushed, equal parts embarrassed and defensive. Allen cleared her throat. "Mr. Brooks will be releasing a formal statement Monday, but for now, the funding for the literature department will remain untouched." Elijah didn't react. She continued. "We've also voted to form a review committee. There will be a full audit of faculty curriculum evaluations, grading trends, and disciplinary actions from the past 10 years. Principal Hendricks raised an eyebrow. "That's unexpected." Allen hesitated. "Frankly, we had no choice. Your performance was illuminating. But also, troubling revelations have come to our attention." Elijah turned. "What kind of revelations?" he asked. Allen swallowed. "Regarding Professor Whitmore." She didn't elaborate. But by Monday morning, the school buzzed again. Only this time, it wasn't about Elijah. It started with a leak, a faculty-wide memo, accidentally forwarded to a student by a staff assistant. Within minutes it hit Reddit, then Discord, then Twitter. The memo revealed preliminary findings from the board's internal audit. For nearly 8 years, Professor Whitmore had consistently graded black and brown students 12–18% lower on average than their white peers, even when controlling for attendance, test scores, and homework completion. He had cited language issues, attitude concerns, and lack of academic discipline as reasons in personal notes, using coded phrases that painted these students as less capable. The audit uncovered a buried lawsuit from 5 years prior. A black student had accused Whitmore of racially biased grading. The case had been settled quietly, NDA signed. No record made public. But the data now laid it bare. Whitmore hadn't been defending academic rigor. He had been gatekeeping it. The backlash was immediate. Students gathered outside his classroom the next day with signs. Grading isn't objective when you are. Our intelligence isn't conditional. The lit crew printed flyers with quotes from the leaked report. One student shared their grade history, showing how they dropped from a B to a D after switching sections into Whitmore's class. Another recalled how he once told her, "Maybe literature's more your pace." Parents started calling. The district placed Whitmore on administrative leave by Wednesday. But the damage had already been done. In the staff lounge that afternoon, the mood was brittle. Some teachers whispered in corners. Others avoided eye contact. Miss Kingsley, the history teacher, finally spoke. "This should have come out years ago." Mr. Tran added, "We all saw how he talked to certain students. We just let it slide." Elijah stood by the coffee pot, silent. He didn't gloat, didn't smirk. He simply poured his coffee and waited, because this wasn't a victory. It was an exposure, a peeling back of skin from the quiet rot underneath. That night, the superintendent released a statement. "We are deeply troubled by the findings and are committed to reevaluating our assumptions around academic objectivity and equity." The phrase academic objectivity trended on Twitter for the wrong reasons. News outlets picked up the story. National headlines read, "Elite school rocked by racism in the ranks. Professor suspended after hidden bias unveiled." Elijah didn't do interviews. He stayed in his classroom, taught his students, listened to them. They needed that now. But on Friday, a package arrived at the school. No return label. Inside, a notebook. Elijah recognized the handwriting immediately. It was from a former student, the boy who had filed that buried lawsuit years ago. The notebook read, "They told me to let it go, that I was being dramatic, that my grade didn't matter. Watching you stand at that board, I realized I wasn't wrong. I was just early." Elijah closed the notebook. His hands trembled, but not from fear, from validation. The system had tried to erase voices like his, like that student, but not anymore, not ever again. Whitmore is found to have a history of racially biased grading, and one buried lawsuit. It started with a tweet. A student from Madison West posted a clip, not of the challenge itself, but of Elijah's erasure. The moment he wiped Whitmore's rigged equation off the board and wrote something new, a clean frame, crisp audio, and the caption, "Mr. Brooks didn't solve their problem. He solved the real one." By morning it had over 2 million views. Then came the headlines. "Math Showdown turns into lesson on racism." He solved the system. Black teacher redefines genius. When the board was the problem. A viral challenge exposes education's bias. The Atlantic. National media descended on Madison West. The school's name, once whispered within academic circles for its competitive math program, was now synonymous with something much louder and far more important. News vans parked outside the campus. Reporters loitered near the front office. A documentary crew from Netflix even made an inquiry. But Elijah remained quiet. He still arrived at 7:15 a.m., still taught his students with calm purpose, still held after-school lit crew meetings, now doubled in size. The world had changed around him. He hadn't. Yet, on Tuesday afternoon, he was called to Principal Hendrix's office again. This time her expression was unreadable. "There's a representative from Emerson University waiting," she said. Elijah raised an eyebrow. "Emerson? One of their provosts. Apparently they've been following this evolution closely." He walked into the office. A tall man in his 50s stood. Silver tie, crisp suit, eyes like he measured time in semesters. "Mr. Brooks," he said, "I'm Dr. Lionel Gates. We've admired your work for some time, and after recent events, we'd like to extend an offer. Elijah waited. Gates continued. We're creating a new initiative, a cross-disciplinary fellowship exploring intersections between mathematical reasoning and literary narrative, a hybrid field. We'd like you to lead it. Elijah blinked. I teach high school. Gates nodded. And precisely because of that, you understand where education begins to fail. He slid an envelope across the table. Inside, a full offer. Salary, title, resources, autonomy. One line stood out. Position visiting chair, Department of Interdisciplinary Truths. Elijah was stunned. He looked up. There's one condition, Gates said. Elijah tensed. We'd prefer you refrain from further public criticism of Madison West while affiliated with Emerson. Discourse, yes, but no direct indictments. Silence. Elijah leaned back. So you want me to build something new, but not hold the old accountable? Gates shifted. We're not asking you to lie, just to transition the conversation. Focus on solutions. Elijah didn't answer. Instead, he thanked him, took the folder, and walked out. Later that night, he sat at his desk, the classroom empty, the chairs stacked, the Baldwin quote still framed on the wall. He opened the folder again. The offer was real, tangible, life-changing, but it came with silence, and silence had never protected him before. Suddenly, there was a knock. Marcus stepped in. He held a tablet. Have you seen? Elijah looked. It was a live stream, a panel discussion titled, Is Meritocracy Real? Lessons from Madison West. On it, 3 scholars, 1 conservative commentator, and surprisingly, board member Allen. Elijah watched as Allen spoke. It was never about whether Mr. Brooks could solve the problem. It was about who had the power to write it. And for the first time, we saw that power questioned. The panelist next to her added, We're talking about rethinking how we define intelligence in schools. Whose knowledge is seen as valid? Whose histories get quantified? Elijah turned to Marcus. You know what this means, he asked. Marcus nodded. Yeah. They're watching now. Elijah smiled faintly. He didn't say yes to Emerson that night. But the next morning, he opened class with a new unit. Title, Equity as Equation. And at the bottom of the board, in chalk, who writes the test and who gets tested. Elijah is offered a university position, but under one controversial condition. The decision sat like a stone in Elijah's chest. For the first time in years, he had leverage, visibility, national respect, and a path forward that didn't involve ducking glances in the faculty lounge or overhearing veiled comments about qualified hires. But the scars were still fresh. Every day at Madison West now came with more polite nods, more cautious respect, but Elijah saw what lingered beneath: resentment, regret, rebranding. The same people who once whispered about diversity hires now quoted his equations in meetings, as if proximity to him could wash away their silence. He didn't need their redemption. He needed honesty. The Emerson University offer still sat on his desk, unopened for a third day. He hadn't told anyone, not even Marcus. The title was impressive, the salary, life-changing, but the conditioned silence about the very wounds he'd bled from felt like a muzzle wrapped in gold. Was elevation worth erasure? On Thursday, Principal Hendricks invited him to a lunch meeting. Just the two of them. No cameras. No statement. You've changed this place, she said, handing him a cup of tea. Whether you stay or go, the impact is real. He nodded but didn't respond. She sighed. You're not obligated to remain in a place that tried to bury you. But if you do, I'll fight alongside you. It was the first time she had ever said it out loud, and it landed harder than applause ever had. Elijah stared at the window for a long time. You know, he finally said, I used to tell myself I was here for the kids, that it didn't matter what the staff said, what the board ignored, as long as I reached them. And, she asked. And I did reach them, he said. But I also absorbed everything else. The microaggressions, the professional gaslighting, the subtle racism dressed as academic standards. It wears you down. She nodded. I know it does. That afternoon, Elijah walked the halls slowly. He passed his old classroom. The door now bore a laminated printout of Morrison's quote, Definitions belong to the definers, not the defined. He paused at the window. Inside, Marcus was leading a peer session. On the board, a blend of math and metaphor, a story woven into a structure, a synthesis Elijah had modeled without even knowing. It wasn't perfect, but it was different. In the staff lounge, A different mood had settled. Some teachers nodded. Others still looked away. But no one spoke with the authority they once held over him. It was as if his success had rewired their comfort zones. He didn't need to be feared, but he wanted to be respected, and that still felt conditional. Then came Friday. Students from multiple schools had organized a protest, not against Madison West, but for Elijah, for equity, for a curriculum that valued stories alongside statistics, for the teachers who were told their subjects were less rigorous. They gathered in the courtyard, hundreds strong, holding signs like, "Teach the full equation. Literature is logic. We are not extra credit." Media outlets showed up again. But this time, the students led the narrative. Marcus spoke first. He didn't talk about grades or clubs. He talked about how he had almost given up on himself until he heard Elijah connect Baldwin to binary code. How he finally saw his mind as something valid, not exceptional in a patronizing way, but real. Then came a poetry student named Rhea. She read a piece titled The Math of Memory, in which she compared her grandmother's fading voice to a recursive loop, her father's deportation case to an unsolvable inequality. The crowd was hushed, but in the middle of it all stood a 12-year-old girl. Nervous, small hands clutching a folded piece of paper. Her name was Alea. She didn't go to Madison West. She had come with her older cousin, a lit crew member. When the mic passed to her, she trembled. A student tried to help, but she shook her head. Then she read, "They said your chalk was soft, but it cracked the ceiling. They said your questions were poetry, but they solved our silence. I heard you once, in a hallway, talking to no one. A line from a poem you never published. I remembered it." She paused, then recited it. "They wrote the rules in ink we couldn't touch, so I taught my students to write in thunder." The crowd went silent. Elijah stood at the back, eyes glassed over. He had written that line years ago, alone, in his notebook, never spoken it aloud. He stepped forward, stunned. "How did you—" Alea looked up, smiling. "Your student shared it. Said you used to write poems no one saw. He wanted the world to see one." The crowd erupted. He couldn't speak. In that moment he realized something bigger than whether to leave or stay. He realized that what he created in the classroom, in his students, wasn't just curriculum. It was legacy. And legacy didn't come from titles. It came from resonance. That night, Elijah sat in his empty classroom, the Emerson folder open, the poem Elijah had read, sitting beside it. His hand hovered between the two. Was safety worth silence? Could he change more from inside a university than within a high school that still bruised him? Or was his presence here, his continued presence, the very protest that mattered most? He didn't answer. But he didn't pack either. Instead, he erased the board, wrote the day's date, and beneath it, "What is a system, and who decides its variables?" At a student protest, a young girl reads a poem Elijah once wrote in silence. By the end of the semester, Madison West no longer looked like the same school. It wasn't just the banners of equity in the halls or the district's updated curriculum guidelines. It wasn't even the media van that had finally packed up and left. It was in the subtler things: who raised their hand in class, how staff spoke in meetings, what got hung on the walls. Silence had been replaced by language, discomfort replaced by reckoning. The board's formal changes hit faster than anyone expected. For the first time in district history, literature and humanities courses were included in the academic honor pathway. Performance evaluations for staff now required cultural equity assessments. Disciplinary practices were rewritten to focus on transparency and cultural bias training. But most shocking of all, the math department now had to co-teach 2 units per semester with language arts faculty to explore the narrative power of numbers. Whitmore never returned. His resignation came quietly, buried in a short faculty email, thanking him for his years of service. Students didn't mourn his departure. A few whispered about the NDA he might have signed. Others, especially those who'd received his dismissive grades, felt nothing at all. Elijah, meanwhile, began preparing for something else. He hadn't yet signed with Emerson, but the invitation remained open, without condition, thanks to student and public pressure. Instead of deciding, he focused on something that mattered more to him: a final lecture. Not for college. Not for acclaim, but for his students. The day arrived quiet. No bells, no announcements, just a handwritten flyer posted around the school.
"Mr. Brooks, final lecture. Courtyard, 3:30 p.m.
By 3:25, the courtyard was full. Current students, alumni, parents, faculty, even a few board members, stood in the soft light of a fall afternoon. Elijah stood beneath the same oak tree where the protest had happened weeks earlier. This time, no chance, just anticipation. He carried no notes, no microphone, only chalk. A temporary board had been wheeled into the grass, the same board he'd once stood at, defending his intellect. He turned to it and wrote one line. Knowledge is a narrative, so what's the story you're telling? He turned. For too long, intelligence has been measured by proximity to systems that were never built for us. We've been taught that brilliance is what survives the filter, not what rewrites the exam. He looked across the crowd. You've all been tested, not just in classrooms, but in expectations, in glances, in dismissals dressed as feedback. And every time you've shown up, not just to pass but to redefine. He paused. I'm not here to teach you how to beat their game. I'm here to remind you that you can build your own. The wind moved gently through the courtyard. A few parents wiped tears. Students held notebooks. Some of you will write equations. Some will write essays. Some will write songs. But all of you, if you choose to, will write change. He stepped back, laid the chalk down, and said quietly, "That's my final lesson."
The applause started slow.
But built into something bigger. Not the roar of victory, but the sound of something settling, a generation shifting. He hugged Marcus, thanked Olivia, shook hands with Principal Hendricks, and then, with his satchel over his shoulder, Elijah walked out the school gates. No cameras, no press, just a man leaving the battlefield, not defeated, not exalted, but changed. As the courtyard emptied, one teacher remained. A young black woman. New hire. STEM background. Her name was Ms. Rayner. She rolled the board back into the building, and before she returned it to storage, she stopped by her own classroom. The next morning, students entered her class to find something unexpected. On the board, the same equation Whitmore had written. The impossible one. The trap. But something was different. She had added a single word beside it. Discuss. And then, a hand rose. A young black student in the front row. He didn't flinch. Didn't wait. He stood up, walked to the board, picked up the chalk, and began. As he leaves campus, a new teacher writes the same equation on the board, and this time, a black student steps up. No one should have to rewrite themselves just to be respected. Elijah stood his ground so the next student wouldn't have to. If you've ever been underestimated because of who you are, type yes. If you believe in justice,